Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Khanrawa. With the election of Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency of the Islamic Republic of Iran, there is much speculation about the shape and direction of US-Iranian relations in the coming years. To help us better understand this fraught relationship, I am pleased to announce that here at the Arab Center, we have partnered with our colleagues in Washington, the Arab Center, Washington, DC, and my good friend and colleague, Khalil Jahshan, will introduce our distinguished speaker, who's also one of the best commentators on the topic. And we have quite an interesting discussion in front of us. Khalil?
Thank you, Mehran. Appreciate having this opportunity again to partner with you on this very important event, particularly in light of course, the recent developments in the region that even emphasized this event more and more. As everybody knows, on August 3rd, 2021, as you just said, Sayyid Ibrahim Raisi Sadati, commonly known or referred to as Ibrahim Raisi, became the 8th president of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And since that election on June 18, where he won 62.9% of the elections, even though there were a lot of questions about the validity of those results, he won allegedly 18 million of the 29 million votes cast in that elections. However, many questions, as Mehran just implied, have been raised since then about the new president's credentials, focusing mostly on his ability to govern effectively at this very challenging phase in Iran's both domestic and foreign policy spheres. Some of these questions definitely pertain to his well-known, widely known conservative Islamist and hardline views, his past record as a Muslim jurist, particularly his performance as deputy and eventually chief justice, his 2-year stint as Attorney General, his several years as a prosecutor and deputy prosecutor in Tehran going back to the 80s and 90s. Of course, of particular concern to those of us interested in civil and human rights in Iran, his membership in the so-called death panel or death committee, accused of ordering the execution of thousands of political prisoners that contributed actually to Raisi's accusation of crime against humanity by UN agencies and to his being sanctioned by the US government. So questions that we would like to focus on this morning or this afternoon based on where you are located. We're lucky to have a very international audience today, more than 200 people. For some of you, it's good morning. For some of you, it's good afternoon. And for some of you, it's good evening. But it's good to have all of you. The questions we would like to tackle this morning, will Raisi be able to represent Iran before the international community? A basic question, can he even travel to Western countries, which he has avoided for reasons that I just referred to? Will he be able to lead Iran into this new phase of relations with the West in general and the US in particular that many people are hoping for or anticipating? How will his hardline views impact the Vienna talks, the attempt to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal? How will he be reacting any different than his predecessor with regards to the unfolding events in Afghanistan and the withdrawal of the U.S. Politically and militarily from the region? So these and many other questions certainly are on the mind of many of you today. And frankly, we have no one better equipped to handle these questions than our special guest today, Vali Nasr, who is the Majid Khadouri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies here in Washington, D.C., and the non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. Between 2012 and 2019, Vali served as the Dean of SAIS, and between 2009 and 2011 as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. So he has bridged, in a way, in a rare way, the gap, if you will, between academia, think tank work, and government. He has previously taught at Tufts University Fletcher School, the Naval Postgraduate School, Stanford University, University of California, San Diego, and University of San Diego. He is the author of several books, including the most relevant probably to us today is The Dispensable Nation, American Foreign Policy in Retreat. Also, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of a New Muslim Middle Class and How It Will Change Our World. He's also well known for his writings and his book on the Shia revival and many other publications that I'm sure most of you are fully aware of. Vali has received his BA from Tufts University in International Relations, and he has earned his master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in International Economics and Middle East Studies back in 1984, and his PhD from MIT in Political Science in 1991. He will be addressing these and other questions in a minute, but let me just, before I pass the microphone to Professor Nasr, mention to you that, as Mehran said, it's a pleasure for us here in Washington, D.C. To join forces with Mehran and his capable coordinator, Hamidi Dorzadi, on this program, and we look forward to future common projects. The Arabic interpretation, as it has been announced earlier, is available under Spanish. So if you want to listen to that translation, click on the globe at the bottom of your page and pick Spanish for Arabic, because that's the most convenient way to include Arabic translation. Vali has been very gracious to be willing to accept engaging with you directly in a Q&A session after his presentation. And you can join us in that either by using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom page, or for those of you watching the live stream, you can email us at events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org, and these questions will be passed to me, and I'll be more than glad to read them. Please mention your name, your affiliation, and we'll be glad to pass your question on to our special guest. So, Dr. Nasr, again, welcome, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Khalil, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Mehran, and for inviting me to this session. It's wonderful being with you, and thank you to your team and Hamida for organizing it. Although much of the attention in the past 2 weeks has been on U.S. departure from Afghanistan, and of course that has a bearing on the conversation today, Iran remains the most important immediate challenge that the Biden administration has to deal with in the Middle East. The issue of Iran's nuclear program, its fate, where do the two countries go, is an issue that became an acute problem for American foreign policy during the Trump administration. It created an escalated situation that it was not able to resolve. And now we will witness whether the Biden administration is able to resolve this, or whether we might end up in a very difficult situation in the region. Now, what is interesting about this is that both countries have gone through a political transition to arrive at the point we're in. First, the regime or the government in the United States that actually imposed the maximum pressure moved out of JCPOA, and in other words, disrupted the nuclear negotiations and the nuclear agreement that was in place since the Obama administration left office in January. And now the administration in Iran that negotiated the nuclear deal with the Obama administration, supported the nuclear deal, and to try to keep it alive, also has left office. And so the two countries will meet again in November, essentially under the two administrations that were not responsible for the events that have brought us to here. Now, many of the questions that Khalil asked, we really don't know yet, because Mr. Raisi has really effectively taken office less than a month. His team, foreign policy team, for instance, was approved by the parliament only a short while ago. And so we really don't know exactly what his leadership style would be, how engaged he will be, how focused he might be on foreign policy. But I do think personalities do matter, as we've seen. Personality not only of the top person in both countries, but the personality of the team that actually does the negotiations going forward. But having said this, there are some fundamental issues that are driving U.S. Iran relations and the future of the nuclear deal. And I want to first deal with that. We didn't arrive at this moment out of a vacuum. The backdrop to the moment we're in and where Iran will go under Raisi. And in fact, Raisi's own election has a lot to do with the maximum pressure strategy of President Trump. So the maximum pressure strategy was designed to essentially bring Iran to its knees. Now, one interpretation is that the United States wanted a better deal, a deal that was tougher on the nuclear issue, that would include regional issues, include Iran's missile program, and it just wanted Iran to come to the table for another deal. There are others, particularly within Iran, and perhaps many on the conservative side, and the supreme leader included, that believe that the United States' aim was regime change in Iran. That maximum pressure was not about getting Iran back to the table. Maximum pressure was about changing the regime in Iran by inflicting severe economic pain on the country. And it did. The maximum pressure was effective as much as a sharp knife is effective when you apply it to a skin, it cuts. It devastated Iran's economy. It impoverished the Iranian people. At least by some estimates, Iranians themselves had anticipated that the size of the Iranian middle class would grow by 35% perhaps over a decade as a result of JCPOA. Instead, about 10% of the Iranian middle class fell under the poverty line and went below the middle class line. And those who are within the middle class, by and large, have very little disposable income. There is no question that it has created unemployment, inflation, impoverishment in the Iranian society and economy. And these impacts were accentuated by the entire experience of COVID, which disrupted trade for Iran, which disrupted travel. And also really Iran has been battered by wave after wave of COVID infections. Now, a lot of it might have to do with with mismanagement of the government, but the cumulative effect it reflects the problematics of isolation in the country. Maximum pressure has also created deep discontent and distrust of the United States at a very deep level. So at the popular level, there is anger towards the regime and its mismanagement, a lot of anger towards President Rouhani for his handling of COVID and the economy and relations with the West, but also generally a deep distrust of cutting any deals with the United States. I mean, the Iranians do fault President Trump for double dealing, signing a deal, then taking it off the table, and then saying, well, I now want a new deal. So we both agreed to a deal. You gave up what you did. I didn't give up what I did. I'm going to keep what you gave up. Now I want you to give up even more. And we have to also note that, in these negotiations, any country, whether it's Iran or another one with the United States, gives up actual things, things that actually have been built, facilities, enrichment plans, etc. The United States doesn't give up anything material. It gives up a piece of paper, which is a sanction, which is a law, which could easily be put back in. So there is now a very different mood in Iran about engaging the US and how trustworthy the United States is. And my suspicion is that the reading of the way they handled Afghanistan actually will deepen these, and the message of Iran to many across the region, including its clients, including governments that might be dealing with the United States, is to say, basically, the United States is untrustworthy. We saw it in JCPOA, you can see it in Afghanistan, and this now runs very deep. So the attitude towards the United States is very different from 2013. The attitude towards how you should even approach negotiations is very different. The supreme leader allowed the Vienna talks to go forward. And he basically sidelined a lot of the naysayers in Iran who didn't want to, on the conservative side, who didn't even want the Vienna talks. But he was very firm that, you fool me once, shame on you. You fool me twice, shame on me. That, you go there, but you're entering in negotiations that there's no guarantee that the United States will not renege on that again. Now, Iran also reacted to the maximum pressure after 1 year of waiting to see whether the Europeans could save it by escalation strategy of its own. And this escalation strategy went down two paths. So one was that Iran started backing away from its 100% commitment that it had to adhere to under JCPOA. So it started gradually enriching. It started adding research facilities. It started adding new centrifuges, higher quality centrifuges. Every 6 months, every few months, it would move away from one commitment. And now it has broken some commitments, including actually building uranium metal and using enriching uranium to the level of 60%. So these were ways in which to tell the Europeans and the Americans that, look, maximum pressure does not work. It actually is creating a more dangerous situation, but also was a way of giving Iran leverage if it wants to go back into negotiations to have something to negotiate with. The second way in which the Iranians started escalation was in military or kinetic activities around the Persian Gulf. So it started with obviously deniable. They denied it, but the fingerprints were there of the attack on tankers in Fujairah. Then it went to the sort of high points of shooting down an American drone over disputed territorial waters over the Gulf, to the attack on Abqeir. And eventually it got into the tit for tat in Iraq, which led to the killing of General Soleimani. Now, the question that after, we also have to think about, yes, after the killing of Soleimani, there was some sort of Iranian may have backed off, but the Iranian retaliation for Soleimani, which was to launch, tens, if not 100 missiles at the Al-Assad base in Iraq, also crossed a line that had never been crossed before. The U.S. military, the U.S. soldiers have never been attacked at this rate by missiles ever. Not in World War I, not in World War II, not in Vietnam, never. And the United States basically was happy that nobody died. And President Trump tried to downplay it by saying a few soldiers got headaches. It's not a big deal. But there is a line that you cross that changes mentality within a country and changes particularly the mentality of security services. Yes, they lost Soleimani, but I think the IRGC came out of that experience far more bullish. First, before the shooting down of, by mistake, of a Ukrainian airliner, the outpouring of sentiment in Iran, so along nationalistic lines for Soleimani's death, was a surprise. It was a surprise within Iran. It was a surprise outside of Iran. I don't think the Iranian government would have had time to organize crowds across the country at this scale on such short notice. This is not a parade that you had a year to plan for. And there was genuine anger at that killing, and Soleimani became posthumously, after death, he became a bigger figure in Iran's national politics than he was when he was alive, when he was largely known within the security services. But also the way Iran responded to this also sort of gave the guards a great deal of confidence in their own abilities. And I think both countries, after that experience, yes, they showed that they didn't want to go to war, but Iran also psychologically crossed the line in its confrontation with the US that plays differently in the minds of its leadership now. And it gives us and you cannot go back to where they were before all of this took place. And then domestically, I would say the entire maximum pressure was a unique opportunity for the conservatives and the supreme leader to consolidate power in Iran. Those Iranians, like President Rouhani or Foreign Minister Zarif, despite all the criticism they get around the region or the world, fundamentally believe that Iran had to have an anchor in its relations with the West, that it was important for Iran to sort of seek a kind of future that has the West as a part of it. And this, for them, the nuclear deal was this opening because it would allow trade relations and economic relations that would then tie Iran and Iran's middle class to the West. And they were discredited because they essentially were blamed at varieties of levels for having been naive, for having made Iran weaker. And even they themselves, by the end, came and said that they were wrong to trust Europe and the United States the way they did, and that entire school of thought in Iran lost out. And the supreme leader saw this as an opportunity, in other words, to eliminate, if you would, the moderates as a real political force in the presidential elections, in the parliamentary elections, and even in the political discourse in the country. And that was a loss. Ultimately, the result of maximum pressure, ironically, was regime change in Iran, but not the kind of regime change Secretary Pompeo had in mind. It was regime change by handing over Iran 100% to its most hardline component. And they did this, as we can see, with very little resistance. Secondly, we know, and this has been news, that Iran pretty soon, nobody knows when, but perhaps in the term of the next Iranian president, Mr. Raisi, and this Iranian president is likely to go through a succession for the supreme leader. And that succession, I think the supreme leader wanted all of Iran's main political institution, that's the presidency, the legislature, the armed forces, etc., all be under the hands of the conservatives, and that there be no serious moderate contender for that office. I mean, had JCPOA survived or even thrived, probably President Rouhani would have been a very strong contender for that office. He no longer is. And in fact, there is no moderate now who would be really strong contender for becoming supreme leader. So this dynamic was very important in the election of Mr. Raisi. As Khalil said in his introduction, his entire career has been in the judiciary. He has very little experience in managing anything outside of the judiciary. As head of as the chief justice in Iran, as the head of the judiciary, he sat on national committees, but this was for a very small period of time, and it was not in an executive decision-making role. He has very little foreign policy experience. And in the judiciary, he was not known to be a sort of an intellectual thinker. He was a bureaucrat. And even his role on that death committee, etc., was part of his bureaucratic appointments. And he was a very good subservient servant, including, as we saw on the death committee, implementing orders that came to him from his bosses. And I think that was the reason why the supreme leader saw him as the right person. In a way, he was groomed for this role, and he owes his rise to power, even though his family also is a very well-connected family. His father-in-law is the most powerful cleric in Iran's Khorasan province on Iran's east side. But nevertheless, his rise to the top to first lead the judiciary and then become president was really engineered by the supreme leader's secretariat, by the Beta Rahbari, as it's called in Iran, the household of the supreme leader. And so it's going to take time for him to sort of grow into this role and even sort of sprout wings, especially on foreign policy. I mean, part of the reason why he's not looking to travel is because he just does not have ambitions there. This is all very, very new to him. But we don't know whether he will remain a subservient follower of orders from the supreme leader, or as we saw with President Ahmadinejad, that he might begin to assert his own prerogative as president and become a bit unruly to manage. And I think he will have a lot on his plate domestically. He has to manage the economy, he has to manage COVID. And also the supreme leader very adroitly has put competitive conservative forces in charge of the parliament and in charge of the judiciary. For instance, Mr. Raisi did not get his candidate to lead the judiciary. And yes, the conservatives control Iran, but there are factions among them. And now that they're not fighting against the moderates, their own rivalries are coming to the fore. So Mr. Raisi is going to have his hands full trying to rise above other conservative contenders as the sort of the supremo person, and he has to prove his credentials. And I think that makes him very interested in the nuclear deal, because I don't think he can govern Iran, nor the succession to the supreme leader can be smooth if the Iranian economy is in the situation that it is. And that's why even during the campaign, Mr. Raisi said positive things about JCPOA, about negotiating with the US, about the fact that removing sanctions on Iran was the top priority for any government in Iran. So yes, he is technically adhering to the resistance economy, self-sufficiency, relying on your own, but in reality, he understands that some kind of a deal with the United States is necessary for stabilizing the economy in Iran, that his success now depends on what he can do. I mean, the period of blaming Rouhani for everything is over. That helped Raisi get elected. But now that he's the president, it falls on him to deliver food and medicine and create jobs and reduce inflation. And I think that's a leverage the United States has there, that Iran ultimately does need that relief. Now, on the other side, the Biden administration came into sorry, I think I lost you for a minute. The Biden administration came in with the promise of restoring JCPOA, but it didn't move on that immediately. It actually got caught between domestic political sensibilities, where his advisors told him Iran is the third rail right now in politics. It's the only bipartisan issue that the Republicans and Democrats may agree to criticize a return to JCPOA. And that even if you waited, perhaps the pressure on Iran would build further. And therefore, it basically signaled that he was in no hurry to go back to the deal. And we're seeing now, even the Iranian foreign minister now recently tried to reciprocate that sentiment, saying, well, we have to wait a few months before our government settles in, before we're ready to talk to you, which is largely sort of a tit for tat posturing. But when they eventually were persuaded to go back to the talks sooner than maybe they anticipated, because Iran began to escalate enrichment aggressively. And that puts the United States in the same bind that it found itself in Afghanistan. For a government that's not interested in war, there are not that many options then. right? So the Iranians, knowing that Biden has his hands full with China, with COVID, with climate, has come to power claiming he wants to end forever wars, would not want to go to war with Iran. Because the only reason the United States may go to war in the Middle East right now, the only reason, in my opinion, is to stop an Iranian nuclear weapon. I mean, if Iran gets to 2 months, 1 month breakout, the pressure will build for some kind of military action. And that was very much the case before Afghanistan was the issue. And the Iran, by increasing enrichment, by actually saying we're going to go to 60%, and this was even announced by the Supreme Leader at one point when he got really frustrated with the US, he said we should go to 60%. And I think the Biden administration understood that actually waiting now was in Iran's advantage, not in America's advantage. Because the longer you wait, the more Iran has to bargain with. The sooner you go to the table, they have less to bargain with, and you have a better leverage. So in fact, waiting was no longer in America's advantage. And that's when the Vienna talks actually started. And although they were in fits and spurts, I think they progressed fairly well. And within the third or fourth round, about, I think, 90% of all issues, which is which sanctions are going to be lifted, when is Iran going to remove these centrifuges or those centrifuges, were agreed on. And then sort of the last piece of this, the last part of it ended up being the most difficult, which is to say that end of the day, when the last sort of meetings happened before the election in Iran, what was on the table for Iran was a deal that best is characterized as less for more. In other words, the United States is going to give less to Iran than Iran got in 2015, even though US had left the deal, but expects more from Iran than Iran gave in 2015. So, which is a very problematic issue domestically within Iran, because you go back to your country and say, you know, we toughed it out. We didn't do anything. We abided by the deal in 2015. We're going to go back in the deal. We are in the deal. US is going to come back in the deal with Iran getting less from the deal than it was supposed to in 2015, and US getting more from the deal than in 2015. And part of the problem from negotiations from day one is that Iran has wanted to negotiate a return to JCPOA, but from the day they met in Vienna, the US is not interested in JCPOA. The US is already negotiating the next deal. And the reason for that is that some provisions of JCPOA will expire under Biden's term in 2023. And so the president is very keen that he addresses those. And also they know that as sanctions get lifted on Iran, the Iranians will have less reason to negotiate for a follow-on deal. So the Americans basically don't want to lift all the sanctions, want to hold to some of them. And some of them they say they can't lift because the Trump team put multiple designations on sanctions and they're not easy to lift. But on the other hand, the Iranians want to go back to 2017, exactly things that were in 2017. And that was a disagreement between them. The second issue was that in summer 2021, the US asked Iran that any kind of a deal would require Iran to put in writing that it would already agree to a follow-on deal that would address tighter nuclear issues as well as missiles, regional issues, etc. And the Iranians also, the Iranians were not happy with this, but they asked instead that, okay, in exchange for these, would you guarantee that the next American president would not leave the deal? And the US would not make that guarantee. The US would not even guarantee that Biden himself would not leave the deal by 2023. And they also were not willing to give any kind of waivers to companies that came to Iran, like, for instance, saying that if there would be a 5-year moratorium on certain sanctions, regardless of what happens. So the Iranians came to a conclusion that, look, this deal is useless because no company will come to Iran and invest if at any moment, the United States will demand of the company to leave Iran within a 6-month time period. So what's the point of signing a deal and giving all of this up when there's going to be zero economic benefits? If the idea is just to sell oil, a lesser deal could get you oil, like 1 million barrels in exchange for not enriching beyond 20%, for instance. So I think that's where things got stuck, and Iranians decided not to come back quickly because there was no consensus in Iran what to do, and also Iran went into genuine transition phase where the key personnel were not in their places, and also because I think Iran wants to use as much time as possible to build leverage. My sense, and now Afghanistan has happened. I think there is an overhang, and we don't know how the two capitals are going to interpret Afghanistan and the backlash that happened in Washington to Afghanistan. I mean, for Iran, there are vulnerabilities that the U.S. has shown, but also there is a certain toughness that we've seen in President Biden in sticking to whatever decision he makes that can be both attractive and worrying for Tehran. And the question is also, how much appetite does Washington have for another conflict immediately after Afghanistan happening in the Middle East? So, and then obviously everybody's watching to see whether Iraq will be the next Afghanistan, whether the US will leave Iraq as well. And that at the same time, this conference in Baghdad and the 3 rounds of meetings between Iran and Saudi Arabia are important because I think with the US leaving Afghanistan, I think the regional issue is now still there. The regional problems between Arabs and Iranians are still there, but there's a greater deal movement between them to find ways to coexist and work together. So the meetings between Iran and Saudi Arabia have been squarely on how to fix Yemen. It's not an agreement yet, but there have been serious talks, and a 4th round is supposed to take place within another 2 weeks. So I think everybody's jockeying on the regional side to see how do they live without the United States in the region, and the US has lost a lot of leverage as a main player. But we'll see whether things will end up where they are. And as a final issue, I would say that, with Raisi becoming president, Iran's nuclear file in particular has gone back to the Iran Security Council. It always was there, except during the Rouhani years, where because of Rouhani and Zarif's familiarity with it, it went to the Foreign Ministry. So in the short run, actually, Iran's Supreme Council on National Security under the Supreme Leader is going to be much more in charge of these negotiations than actually the Foreign Ministry is going to be. And let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Vali, for this excellent presentation. A lot of food for thought here, and we're beginning to get some good questions for you. Let me begin as I kind of try to tally these questions a bit. Start with one question myself. You referred to the importance of the recent Baghdad summit, the participation, almost co-sponsorship, if you will, of Iran, almost as supportive as the US of that conference, and the subsequent meetings with the Saudis, and now a 4th meeting or so is being scheduled. Do you feel that as a result of these regional kind of assumption of responsibility and the fact that people in the region seem to be taking matters, if you will, into their own hands in response to US withdrawal, that the balance of power in these negotiations is going to shift to the regional issues versus the international and the nuclear issue?
I think so, largely because the region's concern has never been nuclear, or let's say the nuclear issue has never been the region's primary concern. Regional issues has been their primary concern. And they had looked to the United States to solve the regional issues. Well, the United States did not do in 2015. And now actually the US is signaling that it wants to leave the region. And so the region basically will have to find a way to solve some of these problems on its own. Obviously, for a region in which relationships have been frozen for such a long time, and they don't have any regular mechanism for doing this. There's no region-wide, forum or equivalent of Organization of African States or Organization of American States or ASEAN. It's difficult to do it, but the important first steps are happening through bilateral diplomacy between Turkey and UAE, for instance, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, a first meeting between Qatar and UAE formally on the sidelines of this conference, and then between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I mean, the two countries literally have refused to, or at least the Saudis refused to talk to Iran for a very long time, going back to when they closed their embassy. And now the meetings in Baghdad are significant because they continued, but also because that they are at the highest level amongst security officials. So the Baghdad meeting on the Iranian side is directly under the oversight of the commander of the Quds Force. And the person who chairs the meeting is the deputy to Iran's national security advisor, Admiral Shamkhani. Now, it doesn't mean that after 2-3 meetings, they're going to solve Yemen, but it might reduce tensions between them. It might reduce chances of direct attacks, for instance. It might get some degree of normalization beginning to happen. So these are baby steps. And I think the importance of the Baghdad summit was its symbolism, number one, that the entire region sent somebody, everybody invited, and also is the meetings that happened on the sidelines. So it was icebreaker for the publics in many countries to see that the taboos is broken, right? So I think it falls on the region to pursue this, right? I mean, on the Iranian side, I don't think there's any change in wanting to have that regional dialogue. Okay, Raisi is not going to embrace the Hope Initiative because that was his predecessor's idea, but he's going to pursue the idea of regional engagement as well. And he was very sort of clear on that in his inaugural speech. And I think the Arab side is that they can no longer sort of hide behind the fact that we don't want to talk to the moderates because the real power, the real decision makers are not at the table. Now the real decision makers are at the table. And therefore it's an opportunity to sort of see whether you can arrive at certain understandings. And I would say, this is a lot like the Soviet American negotiations in the 70s. It's not that they have to like each other. Is that they have to agree to certain red lines that both of them can live with and reduce tensions between them.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions. Let me start with Tahseen Abdullah. Would like to know what is different between Rouhani and Raisi's foreign policy in general?
I think the biggest difference is that Rouhani's foreign policy, particularly when he first came in, was West-oriented. He wanted to build ties with Europe, wanted an opening with the US. He knew the limitations, but he definitely believed that Iran needs to have a major anchor in the West. I mean, you could say that in Iran, many refer to them as the Europhiles, people who were enamored with Europe. Raisi wants stability in relations with the US, but he is much more on the side of relations to the East, which is more security and economic relations with Russia and China. And so he sees Iran's future much more distant from the West and more oriented towards China and Russia.
From your perspective, Intikhab Rauf asks, what are the top priorities in advancing a more positive U.S. relationship toward Iran?
The most fundamental thing is trust. So, the two sides have to make an agreement that actually survives over time. I think the biggest tragedy of JCPOA was the damage that it did to trust. And now, they're negotiating. I think the highest priority is that they arrive at an agreement that would stabilize the relationship. I mean, another war in the region could be devastating. Escalation in the region is to nobody's benefit. And nor is Iran going down the path of nuclear power. So I think this is they need to arrive at a deal, and a deal that then both sides would adhere to. You can't build on anything bigger unless the very baby step that you've taken actually holds.
Just a announcement, I guess, to our audience, because I'm getting several anonymous questions. We prefer not to deal with that, frankly. If we're going to give preference to questions where the writers actually indicate their name and affiliation, if possible. So those of you who have done that, if you'd like, just add your name to the same comment or question. We're not trying to dictate to you what to ask, but we prefer that people identify themselves. Vali, in the recent summit between the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States, there was a lot of discussion. Apparently, the item of the agreement with Iran was high on the agenda. Does this give credence to the fact that U.S. policy on Iran in this regard is more like an Israeli policy dictated by Tel Aviv, or is there a different interpretation to that exchange?
Well, the Israelis obviously view Iran and Iran's nuclear program and Iran's regional intelligence and military activities in Syria and Iraq as the most significant security threat to them. And therefore, it's high on their agenda of talking to American presidents. And but we have to also note that there was an element of theater there. Namely, Mr. Bennett is under a lot of pressure from his predecessor, who basically built a career on the Iran threat. I think at some point in his life, Mr. Netanyahu has to thank the Iranian IRGC Quds Force for helping him become the Churchill of Israel. And Netanyahu and Bennett needed this meeting to basically convey to the Israeli electorate that he's tough on Iran. He's doing the same things that Netanyahu used to do, namely go to the White House and lecture an American president on what he needs to do, and that Israel has not lost any of its influence in Washington because Mr. Netanyahu's gone. But substantively, I think this is where Afghanistan really matters. If we look beyond, the sort of the din of the news that we read, the president that we saw on Afghanistan that was tough, took a decision, stands by it, and is willing to tolerate the blowback, and is not willing to change course, even would not extend the evacuation. How do you interpret that? The Biden that we saw in Afghanistan is more important to the region than the images at the Kabul airport. See, that's what, so if you're Israel, you would think this guy has, obviously we've seen that Biden has his own theories of foreign policy. He's probably the most experienced foreign policy president that we've had since George H.W. Bush. And therefore, but at the same time, he has some very strong ideas, and he's not afraid of making tough decisions. So does that mean he's going to lean in Israel's direction, or is that he's going to make decisions that the Israelis don't like and is going to stick with them? I think Israelis are trying to figure this out. Iranians are trying to figure this out. Saudis are trying to figure this out. I think this is really what the overhang of Afghanistan is. That we all of a sudden saw a president that we didn't expect in many ways. He's not the caricature people made of him. And now everybody has to think, what does that mean for me?
Good point. With regards to, you just referred to Biden as one of the probably most foreign policy experienced presidents in United States, at least modern history. There were a couple of questions regarding connecting that with Iran. Is his experience, though, which is more like based on his years in the Senate, more than anything else, is it relevant to this current debate or the issue with Iran and the negotiations with Iran? Do you feel it's related, useful?
Yes, it is related. I mean, he hasn't met Iranian leaders the way he's met every other regional leader, let's say. from Erdogan to King Salman, etc., Netanyahu. I know at some point as senator years ago, he had met Iran's foreign minister when he was ambassador at the United Nations. So he doesn't have that kind of a personal experience with Iranians where he could say, I know what they're thinking. But I think that the larger issue is that Biden has a theory of foreign policy and what should be America's national security. So it's not about Iran per se. It's about where does this conflict with Iran, just like where does the war in Afghanistan, fit into the general way in which he thinks about what's good for America. I mean, what we're seeing is that he laid out 2 days ago a Biden doctrine, which said it's not just no more forever war in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, but no more forever war in this region. So now that would worry Saudis or Israelis, and it would, maybe the Iranians or Hezbollah would think well of that, but in a sense, it tells you that it's not about Iran individually. It's about the fact that he believes the United States should be focused on China, should be focused on climate, and therefore he wants to reduce tensions in this region to a level that does not require direct American military involvement. That does not mean that he will not order cyber attacks on Iran if, for instance, the Iranians did something. But it basically tells you that his inclination is not to pursue war or regime change where you don't know what's going to come out of the other side of it, but is rather stability. So his administration, for the first time that I know, actually was extremely encouraging of the Baghdad summit. Not that he was expecting a breakthrough, but he actually was encouraging the fact that Saudi Arabia and Iran are talking. This is exactly the opposite of the Trump administration, where Secretary Pompeo discouraged the region from talking to Iran and tried to isolate them. So I think we have to look at the overall worldview of Biden and see where does this region fit in there.
Great. Johnny Abu from our social media audience is asking, do you expect some fundamental change in terms of the modus operandi of Ibrahim Raisi as long as Khamenei is the actual ruler in Iran? I mean, what difference does it make?
It always makes a difference. It's like in America, we know that the president ultimately makes the decisions, but we pay a lot of attention to who's the Secretary of State. And end of the day, people who are actually at the table or doing the negotiations or running things or giving opinion do matter. I mean, the supreme leader makes decisions, but he listens, for instance, to who's sitting around the National Security Council table. And the ideas that come out of that, the way they interpret things. Ultimately, the supreme leader reads the reports that government officials write to him. Foreign ministry writes to him. So he has to hear what happened in Baghdad through probably Mr. Abdullahian, as well as the ambassador, as well as intelligence, etc. So the people who sit there and manage these things are influential. That doesn't mean that they make the final decision, but they are important. And I would say the personnel that Mr. Raisi has brought is a mixed bag. For instance, the person he put in charge of Iran's nuclear program had previously been Minister of Transportation, does not really have nuclear science credentials. But the person he made foreign minister was actually the most experienced diplomat among all the other candidates that were there on the right. So he was a deputy foreign minister. He was also the foreign minister advisor to the Speaker of the Parliament. And he's an Arabic speaker and has actually a great deal of experience around the region because he was the deputy foreign minister in charge of the regional issues. So Abdullahian will have probably a lot more to say about the Middle East than Zarif did, but he knows sort of the West less than Zarif did. And then personality in that sense matters. I mean, I think, when we get a very, very bad Iranian president, we say, well, we have to focus on him. So Ahmadinejad all of a sudden was the beginning and end of everything in Iran. And then when you get a president like Rouhani, then people say, well, he's irrelevant. You have to look at the supreme leader. The reality is that Iran is a system, and at various levels, people who are managing things do matter. I mean, Rouhani and Zarif at many points were very influential on the supreme leader, including to actually persuading him to agree to the nuclear talks or agree to go forward. And there was a point where Rouhani did sort of preempt decisions by the supreme leader on a few occasions to keep Iran in the nuclear deal. And so I don't want to say they are the decision makers, but they are very important in that sense, and we shouldn't discount it and just focus on the supreme leader.
Thank you. Let's conclude with this last question from our colleague, Dr. Imad Harb, that deals with the kind of domestic issue, the reference you've made to Raisi being able to manage the factionalism that you referred to among the conservatives and distrust of reformers, although that has somewhat weakened lately. But do you believe he will be able to deal with these domestic issues effectively?
Well, there are two sets of domestic issues. The one is that can he actually address Iran's economic and social problems? Can he improve people's lives? If he does, then his hand will be a lot stronger. If he cannot, then other conservatives are sitting in the parliament or the chief of the judiciary, etc., are going to have the balance of power shifts towards them. So, and that's why I think Raisi has a vested interest in some kind of a deal with the United States that would bring some degree of funding to Iran and open the economy to the extent that would stabilize Iran. Now, that does not mean that Iranians are willing to take any deal. So if it's a really bad deal, it's not going to happen. And we can have really good talks and then no deal. That's what we saw, let's say, with the Oslo peace process. Years of hope and then nothing, right? But what I'm trying to say is that he's not inherently anti-deal, because actually he understands that his own political future very much depends on he being able to deliver to the Iranian people. And Iran has many problems. There's water shortage, there's electricity shortage, there's COVID, there is just pure economic problems. So the bar is pretty low. I mean, you could impress the public pretty easily if you move the needle on some of these issues early on. But for that, I think he needs to get a deal with the US.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nasr, and appreciate your generosity in taking so much time of your busy schedule to be with us today. And we'll let you go a minute or two short, because I know you have another commitment.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It was really great pleasure being with you.
Thank you. Anytime. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like to apologize to the many people in the audience that we couldn't get to your questions at this time. Otherwise, the program would have to go another half hour or maybe even a whole hour. At the end of this great discussion, I would like to thank again Mehran Kamrava and his team for their great cooperation in terms of doing this joint program together. Word of thanks also to my staff, great staff here in Washington, D.C., Tamara, Lana, Nabil, Imad, Zena, and all those involved in this event. Thank you so much for your contribution, and definitely a word of thanks to the audience, the 200 plus people who have registered for this event, and many others who will be watching it on different social media. And we hope to have you again at our future events. Thank you very much. Godspeed to all.